Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Oh, Mail's here.
Owl Post for the week is freshly delivered, and I am just one of the hosts here, Matthew Rushing, and with me, as she is almost every single week in her newly ensconced Owl Post office from Phoenix, Arizona, Andrea Coffman.
Hello.
Hello. How are you enjoying having an office again?
Oh, it's nice.
Yeah. I mean, it looks nice.
Thanks. It's nice not to balance things on my lap or sit at somebody else's desk or, I feel like I've really upgraded my life.
There you go. It's a good feeling. It is definitely a good feeling. So we're excited to be back with you today as we dive into Chapter 7 of the Half-Blood Prince, the Slug Club. Before we get there and start talking about that, just a reminder, of course, you can find us, wherever you can get your podcasts. We highly encourage you. If you are an Apple Podcast, please do give us a star rating and review. Let people know what you think of the show so that they can find us when they're searching for Harry Potter podcasts. And, of course, make sure you're subscribed, too, because that way, every time we drop an episode, you get it the moment it drops. Last but not least, too, you want to make sure that you're following us all over the place. We've got Twitter at Join Nerd Party. We've got Facebook at facebook.com/The Nerd Party. You can also send us an email over at thenerdparty.com/contact. Choose a show, choose Owl Post, and that comes to Drea and I. So many different ways to connect with us. We love talking about Harry Potter. And so, Drea, you mentioned that you had a few shout-outs that we had gotten on social media.
Yeah, so I had someone reach out to me on Instagram. It's ZRE Lorenzo had reached out and said that he's a huge Owl Post fan and that he loves reliving the show he loves reliving the book through our show. So that's always really great to hear. And then we also had Amy Shaw, who does a young adult podcast and reviews young adult books, call us out in her Instagram stories, really enjoying our conversation last week, talking about the Triwizard money and how it sort of created a little bit of redemption for Harry. So, it was really great. It's always really great to know that we're reaching our audience and that people, like what we're bringing to the table. So, I'll keep reaching out. We really love it.
Yeah. It's funny because I've known Amy online for a long time now, and so I always appreciate when she reaches out and share things, and she's definitely been listening to Owl Post from the beginning. So thank you so much to everybody that does that, because it does mean a lot to us. Podcasting can sometimes be lonely, and so when people let us know their thoughts about what we've talked about, one, it's just neat that people actually listen to what we have to say, and the fact that they would spend their time and reach out to that to us like that, just it really does mean a lot. And so all we can say is that thank you. And that seems a little lame that those are the only words we've got, but we really do say thank you for that. So this week, I feel a little bit bad for Harry in the beginning of this chapter, because he's really on this whole Malfoy thing, and that Malfoy is up to no good, and that maybe even Malfoy has taken over for his father as a Death Eater. And interestingly enough, Ron really isn't even a big fan of all of the theories that Harry is throwing out. In fact, Ron seems like he could kind of care less. And so does Hermione. So it's a very frustrating beginning of this chapter for Harry, because he really believes that, Malfoy is up to no good, and his two best friends are kind of like, whatever.
I was thinking about this the other day and how Harry doesn't really get the benefit of the doubt here. Like, you would think after all this time, they should trust his gut, right? Like, he may have it out for Malfoy, he may have it personal, but there also hasn't really been an instance except for Snape, where Harry's gut, well, even then, he was right about Snape. He just doesn't know it yet, but
spoiler alert.
We read a whole chapter about it.
Well, maybe. Yeah. So
we read a whole chapter about how he's in league with the Dark Lord.
True.
I'm not spoiling
you're right.
anything.
As far as we know, you're right. You're right.
As far as we know, and to this point, he's right about him, right? So at this point, his gut is pretty spot on, and you would think that they would learn to trust Harry's gut a little bit, and they're still sort of just writing him off, which is frustrating. And I was thinking about it when I was reading this chapter the other day. I don't know what else he would have to do to get the benefit of the doubt, but that's so real. Like, how many of us have been in something where we're like, we are always right. We are always doing the right thing, and still no one gives us the benefit of the doubt when what we're asking is a little like far-fetched. So I thought it was really interesting that, he's really fixated on this, idea that he's a Death Eater and that nobody really believes him.
Yeah. I think it's funny too that, he keeps trying to kind of bring the subject. Nobody's really listening. So he's about to walk out the door of the room and Ginny's walking in and she's like, "Oh, I'd be careful going into the kitchen right now. There's a lot of phlegm around." They have this quick little moment where, Harry smiles and he's like, "Oh, I'll be careful not to slip in it." And it's super cute. And so, he walks downstairs and he finds out that, they're going to be heading to obviously platform 9 3/4 tomorrow, and that they're going to have an entourage, and he asks about whether or not Tonks will be there, and Fleur has a very interesting reaction to Tonks by saying that she feels like she's really let herself go right now, because the last time they saw her, she did not look great.
Yeah, it's interesting that they're talking about that. They're talking about that she doesn't really look good, and Flem's mentioning like, oh, she needs to take care of herself better in terms, but she's clearly referring to appearance wise. It really was just an interesting moment, and Mrs. Weasley could not have looked more angry.
Yeah. That was really funny. And it's kind of continuing that back and forth that they're having with her, now being part of the family. And so I also kind of love, I just think this is so cute that, once they get there, Fleur makes a point to say goodbye to Harry and gives him a kiss, which his face just gets super red. And I just think it's really adorable. But I also, there's something about the way that she treats Harry with such respect, after what he did for her sister, like she seems to have a real like for Harry and really respect him after that, even though we come to learn, of course, that the kids were never in danger, right? They were never really going to be in danger, but it's just been really interesting to watch that has continued. And she seems to kind of treat him. It feels like she seems to kind of treat him, like an older sister, honestly, might, like their favorite brother in the family, so.
When you think about the fact that, she didn't go to Hogwarts, she went to another school, but I really feel like she'd make a great Hufflepuff because just the way she's just showing such a loyalty to him for such what we could consider at this point now, knowing what we know, sort of a small gesture, right? But it is really interesting that she continues to sort of exhibit this for Harry, which I would think would have, endeared her in the Weasley family a little bit, but apparently not. So I do love, though, that during this interaction, as Ron kind of steps in to try to get a kiss of his own, he like biffs it and then has to just rush into the car because he's so embarrassed. And I thought that was pretty funny. That would totally happen to me. That's why I thought that was funny.
I thought that was great. And it's just so funny too. Because it fits Ron's personality and everything so well. And hey, it is kind of strange that you'd want a kiss from your brother's fiance. Just saying, you probably let that go, Ron. He's taken by another brother. She's taken by another brother. So, but it is actually just really funny. And
it is. It's very funny.
And it goes to show just how much impact still, even a half Vela can have on people, So, I also think it's interesting because Harry pulls aside Mr. Weasley here and mentions his thought process about Malfoy. I love that Harry has to confess where they went, when they seem to disappear, at Fred and George's.
But I love that his reaction is like, he's like, wait, you knew we weren't back there? He's like, dude, I raised Fred and George. Like, I like that he's like not mad. He's not upset. He's just like, you really think we're that dumb? Did you really think we were that dumb? Like, there's kind of a moment for Harry too, where he's like, oh, okay. All right, we'll just move past this now.
Well, and it's really funny because, like you said, I feel like sometimes in movies and TV shows and even books, fathers are kind of portrayed as being kind of like bumbling idiots. And what we see here is Mr. Weasley is very aware of what's going on with his family, but he's also very aware of what's going on in his extended family. And in many ways, Harry is extended family. Harry and Hermione are a part of the Weasley family for all intents and purposes, right? So I think it's, the fact that he's cognizant of what's going on, even though he's been working very late, he's been working a lot, he's still very aware of their goings on, I think speaks very highly to who Mr. Weasley is. And I mean, how much that he cares for his kids and even those kids that aren't his but feel like his kids.
Well, we've talked a lot about this. It was the earlier books, honestly. It kind of went by the wayside here lately because I think it was a little bit of we kind of flushed out everything we could, but we talked about at great lengths, sort of the true family values that the Weasley family has, right? And how they're sort of like, they're not a perfect family, but they're kind of like family goals, right? Like they're parenting goals. And this is kind of just along those lines again, that they're not this is not Mr. Weasley's family, but he treats them like that. Yeah. He still cares about them. They're still under his care. He still wants to do what's right by them. And that's just where you see that. I also really love that part of parenting is not always just having control and controlling the situation, right? Like the way he handled this whole situation when we talked about, I've raised Fred and George before, and that sort of thing. Like he clearly knew what they did, right? But they could have gotten punished. They could have gotten yelled at, but they didn't, because he took a step back and said, everyone turned out okay. They clearly had their reasons, it was just a very mature and emotionally intelligent way to handle the situation. And even when he came clean, he didn't get mad, even though he probably had every right to be upset. Didn't do any of that, was just like, okay, and then listened to what Harry had to say. So I thought it was just a very mature parenting style to do, especially considering he had probably every excuse to not handle that very maturely. He's tired, he's under a lot of stress. This is a really dangerous situation for all of them. So I thought it was a really big moment for Mr. Weasley that is just it's very brief, but pretty impactful.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And it's interesting the conversation that they have because, Mr. Weasley, again, he's discounting pretty much everything Harry is saying. And, he brings up, would they really, would he who should not be named, make a 16-year-old part of his crew, and make him a Death Eater? And what I actually thought was so smart is Harry's finally so fed up. He's like, does anybody really know what he who should not be named would or would not do? Like, everybody's ascribing the fact that they know how this guy thinks. And apparently, from everything we know about Voldemort, he doesn't think like anybody. It's psychopathic, crazy killer man. We're applying logic to somebody who is not beyond logic. Yeah.
It's interesting because he kind of has a sound reasoning of what's going on, and everyone, again, isn't giving him the benefit of the doubt and is taking for granted the fact that they're trying to fight this in a way they know how, with what they know, and that's not what you can do, right? Like, this is a good example of people not really trusting their intuition, not really trusting their gut, because he gets a little more traction with Mr. Weasley than he does with anybody else, right? He's like, well, when we arrested him, we searched his house and we removed anything that could be dangerous. And he's like, well, but this happened after and all that stuff, and kind of talking. He's like, I think he even said something like, we'll check it out, but I don't think anything's going to come of it, basically, is how he phrases it, which, I mean, that's a little more ground than he's made anywhere else. But at the same time, it's still just, it's so frustrating because it's almost like they're just placating him instead of actually listening to him. And what's interesting is when we talk about, you really think that Voldemort would take a 16-year-old onto his crew, essentially, right? It's almost like they're telling Harry that he's not going to be invited to the Order of the Phoenix because he's a 16-year-old, and why would we want a 16-year-old on our side? Like, what? It's almost like demeaning the value the kids play from an adult standpoint. And that's really interesting because so far the people who've made the most traction are the kids. So, it's just kind of that moment where I think Harry's not listening to the message. And that's part of what's frustrating him so much, is that everyone is sort of underestimating Draco. And at the same time, they're underestimating Harry. And he's feeling that without understanding that that's what he's feeling, right? Like, if someone tells you that you're too young or, you don't have the skills or whatever, it's one of those things where you're like, but what if I do? You're just discounting me without understanding. So, it's this theme that plays on and on and on, throughout the first sort of half of this chapter, and nobody really believes him. And then we finally get on the train and remember that there's prefect duties for Hermione and Ron, and Harry's sort of left by himself looking for a car because Ginny takes off to find her boyfriend.
Yeah, I really, this is a small little moment, but I absolutely love is that for Harry, he has this thought process as Ginny kind of walks away. He's like, well, crap, I totally forgot that she doesn't hang out with us like she does when we're at the Burrow. He's gotten so used to her being part of their group, that she's become part of the team in many ways,
I don't know why, but crew is just really resonating with me. Yep. She's not in the crew. They're all crews this episode. It's the episode of crews.
Yeah. And so I think, that's something that I really appreciated. And, I think one of the things we kind of talked about in how, the fifth book kind of opens up Harry's smaller circle. We've seen Neville kind of become a little bit closer. We've seen the fact that Luna has kind of joined their little group in some ways. But Ginny, in many ways, has kind of become the person who's just like literally right outside the bubble of the Trinity. Like she's that, and so it's interesting to see that happen. And, throughout the book here so far already, even 7 chapters in, we have slowly kind of started a little bit of a progression of, I don't know, something with Ginny and Harry. Like it seemed different than other books. And part of that is just because she's even just more a part of the story. In fact, she's going to even be more of a part of this chapter as we move forward. So, Harry does find some people to sit with, and it's the aforementioned Neville and Luna. And I really love that Neville has grown in his grandmother's estimation because of the actions he took. He still believes that, possibly she would rather have Harry as a grandson, but she seems to have been very proud of her grandson really starting to take after his parents. And she's gotten him a brand new wand, and it could have been one of the last wands that Ollivander actually sold. And he's very proud of that as well. And so I just liked that little moment for Neville, and then also on top of that, it kind of leads Harry to begin thinking about Neville and about how, he could have been the one where, he was being dropped off and his parents were there with him, and Neville might have been the person that was the chosen one. Or Neville might not have been there at all, so kind of like thinking through how life had played out. And how different that is. So,
yeah, I had a really hard time reading that section, thinking about like him questioning whether Neville's mom would have loved him the same way, and the thought of it being his mom instead of Mrs. Weasley.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really it's a really melancholy moment for Harry to have to think through that. And it's interesting. And I think, we've talked so many times about the way that Harry is who he is and the fact that he can keep actually moving forward, and that it's amazing to me that these kind of things don't crush him, because it feels like in many ways this could be crushing. And yet I think the fact that he's sitting there with Neville, he's sitting there with Luna, who's so funny, I think that the fact that Harry's not alone in these type of moments is the thing that kind of keeps him sane in some ways. It's the only thing that is... because if he was sitting there on the train by himself in a room where nobody cared about him, it would be much more difficult. But he's not. He's sitting in a place with people that do care about him and like him, So, and that makes it all the difference.
Yeah, and then we get to actually have that little moment where Romilda Vane opens her door and is like, "Oh, Harry, you can sit with us. You don't have to sit with them." And he's like, "They're my friends. Like, why wouldn't I want to sit with them?" And they have this moment where like, "It's okay, Harry. We know we're not cool." And he's like, "I don't care. I don't care."
And he says, "None of them fought with me last summer."
Right. And it's one of those moments where, that's going to have a profound effect in the future. And it has such a deep impact on the relationships they build. And that's why Harry's not alone, right? Like that is why Harry doesn't have to go through that thought process and sit all alone in a car, because he's not Ron.
Mm-hmm.
He's not Ron, who's easily swayed by popularity and appearance and money, which is one of his, character flaws, and we still love him, but it's different. He doesn't succumb to that sort of peer pressure. Like, he wants to stay with those he are truly good. And even though Luna's a little bit loony, and we have another loony moment with her, he knows that deep down she stood by him, and she's a great witch, and she's got an incredible heart, and I love that. I love that we have that little moment, and that he kind of tells off someone there, which will actually prove to come back here in the future as well.
Yeah, I think I really appreciated that, and all the little moments with Luna and how she says like really awkward things like, "Oh, it'd be great if we were friends," kind of thing, and Harry's like, "But we are." And she's like, "Oh, that's nice," like she doesn't quite put together,
believe him.
Yeah. And yet Harry really is sincere in his feelings for, both Luna and Neville. And, they're able to have lunch, and because they're about to have lunch, and, Hermione and Ron have come back, and they talk about how, Malfoy wasn't doing his prefect duty at all. And so this is the moment where things change a little bit on this train ride, where Neville and Harry get an invitation to meet Slughorn in his carriage and have lunch with him. And so as they're walking towards that place, Harry thinks, "Oh, I'll take my invisibility cloak just in case. It could be embarrassing. I'm getting tired of everybody looking at me like I'm the chosen one," which is obnoxious. There's a moment where he passes Cho Chang, and instead of her, everybody else looking at him, she immediately, heads back into her carriage so she doesn't have to have an interaction with him. And they get into this Slug Club meeting.
Well, and I love that when she goes in her carriage, she's with Marietta, who is the one that broke into the Inquisitorial squad last round. And that Hermione's spell and her jinx is still working. Like, no one's been able to get it off. And I love that he has that little surge of pride moment where he's like, yep, that's still there. All right. You know, like, it's both like, yeah, it's there and you deserve to be punished. But also it's, you have that idea that he's just proud of Hermione and her skill as a witch, which I think is just great. And then we enter the Slug Club with Professor Slughorn.
Yep. And this is really interesting. I mean, so the feelings that we had about Slughorn at the, you know, when we first met him, they continue to be, you know, reinforced here, which is he is trying to find ways to collect for himself people of influence and people he feels like might have influence, you know. So he has Neville there, whose parents he knew. You know, he's got, of course, Harry there. He's the chosen one. I mean, why wouldn't he be there? He's got Cormac McLaggen. He's got Marcus Belby, whose grandfather had created the Wolfsbane potion, you know, so pretty famous. I mean, that's the potion that we know Lupin takes, you know, to help himself during his transformation time during the month. So, and strangely enough, but Ginny is there because he saw her hex somebody so well that he was really impressed. And so, you know, it's not just about necessarily people that have connections that he knows about, but he also seems to be somebody who is interested in people that could be very talented down the line as well. So, you know, he's an interesting collector of people, and, you know, this meeting kind of really puts that into place about him trying to pry out of, you know, these students, you know, what is it that might make them special, what connections they might have, and whether or not he would want to continue them basically being in his Slug Club.
Yeah, I did find it really interesting that he pulled Ginny into this meeting, because there's nothing to indicate prior to this that he was also looking for extraordinary talent, right? Previously, he always just was looking for sort of prestige or name recognition. And this is kind of the first time where he goes, okay, well, this young lady impressed me. I'm also going to include her, right?
Yep.
Which shows a little bit of forethought on his part that kind of makes us think he's maybe a little more clever and a little more skilled than we've given him credit for so far.
Yeah. But it also, I love the way you're putting it, because it makes him seem a little less self-serving, you know, like that he actually kind of is interested in students there at Hogwarts that are talented in and of themselves, right? And what that would mean, most likely, too, and this is where it plays into his, you know, other persona, or, you know, his classic persona, really, is they would then be people he would want to know when they graduated because of their talent, because of what they're doing, you know. You know, it's kind of interesting to think that, like, if Slughorn had maybe been there, he might have, like, been supporters of, say, Fred and George, possibly, because maybe he might have seen their talent and realized that it would lie elsewhere. And, you know, when you think about it, Fred and George are great businessmen now. They're, like, running the most successful business in Diagon Alley. So, you know, like, you get this sense, like, that's what he's looking for. He's looking for these people that are going to continually keep him connected. And, you know, it's interesting. And I really actually love how at the end, Neville's like, man, I'm glad that's over. Strange man, isn't he?
Well, and I love near the end, too, that they did a nice job for, like, he kind of starts to make Harry uncomfortable, right? And asking all these questions and things like that. And then he's kind of asking about the ministry, and he's like, and at some point he says something like, I can't answer this without lying. And all of a sudden, Neville steps up and is like, you know what, I'll answer it for you. And we didn't hear the prophecy, and we didn't do this and that. And he's like, yeah, I was there. And Ginny was like, yeah, we were there. Like, there was this moment where it was almost like Slughorn needed to know what he was dealing with. And they stepped up to sort of protect Harry, knowing that he hates this sort of situation he finds himself in. So I thought that was really great. And I love...
On top of that, I was just going to add, because you're right on track, I can't believe I missed that part, because that's also a place where Ginny even goes further by saying, oh, all of this Chosen One stuff is just rubbish. Like, so she's like accentuating that fact, even though, I think she knows better, like, but she doesn't want people. It seems like she's, like you said, she's protecting Harry. And it's again, we were talking about like Harry's circle is widening a little bit, and you've got these other people that are around him. It's not just Harry, or it's just not Ron and Hermione anymore. It's now like Ginny and Neville, who are people that, for them, protecting Harry is really important.
And you get the impression when she's talking about the Chosen One stuff being rubbish, it's not that Harry's not capable, but it's that this whole like fantasy persona that's been created for him is what's rubbish, right? And that he is just really good at what he does, and whatever happens is going to happen. And it's the idea that it just tells you that she's there to support Harry and not to support this like idea of what he should be, right? And that's what she's going to do. And kind of the same for Neville. And it was just such a nice moment to watch them sort of step up for him, and kind of keep him from having to be in an emotionally or morally compromising situation about lying or whatever. So, and it also sort of affirmed why Ginny was there, right? Like, he did pick an outstanding witch kind of out of the crowd, and he was able to accurately identify that. So I thought it was a really great moment. And it sort of helped them ease into the end of this and get back to, out of the Slug Club car, right? And it was just sort of this transition out, and they're just like, oh, thank God that's over.
Yeah, and this is the moment too where Harry has the thought process for himself. Like, he remembers what he heard about Malfoy, and so he follows the beanie back to the Slytherin car, and he makes his way with the invisibility cloak to try and hear, what the conversations are. And he's pretty sure that Malfoy saw him, but he's not quite sure. So he climbs up into the luggage rack and he's listening. And what we're hearing here is all of these things which are kind of confirming Harry's thought process about what's going on with Malfoy. Malfoy seems to be saying everything to help confirm for Harry in his mind that, yeah, Malfoy's up to something. He doesn't even think he might be coming back to school next year. He's alluding to that he's on a mission for Voldemort, and all of these things. And so we're left with this thought that, yeah, Malfoy is up to no good.
So I agree. It's such an it's a different side of Malfoy than we've seen before, right? He's more of the ringleader this time than the show-off, right? Like, he's still kind of boasting a little bit, but it's not the same boasting we've had in the last few books where he can't really back it up. It's more of a confident boasting where, like, he knows there's nothing to really back up and that he has nothing to worry about. Whereas in the past, it's always sort of been empty in the way he carried himself, right? And now you would think that not his dad going to Azkaban and, him living alone with his mother and things like that, that we would have a loss of confidence or less confidence, and he sort of has more. I did find it interesting, and this is just something that kind of stood out to me from this section that I didn't even really think about on previous reads, is when we go into the car and before the rest of the chapter sort of wraps up, they're talking amongst each other, and there's this point where she writes that Malfoy lays his head back down in Pansy Parkinson's lap. And I think that's the moment I realize how old they are. Like, they are solid teenagers, and they're at that romantic, dating, intimate relationship part of their life. And I was like, whoa, hold on a second. They're not kids anymore. Like, I don't know why that's what it was that like triggered it for me. But that was the fact that they're sort of, I never envisioned it that way. It struck me, and I don't really know why. So if anyone has thoughts on that one, send them my way. But that for me, reading this really, really stood out, and really painted an image for me, beyond everything else that we're seeing, in this section. And then how we kind of proceed to wrap up this chapter and what Malfoy does, in this chapter. It just solidifies that I don't see Malfoy does not strike me as a kid at Hogwarts anymore. He is a pre-adult.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. You know, when you read that moment, you do realize these kids are 16 years old. And there's that awakening that's there, you know, like all of them are, becoming a little bit more comfortable in who they are and who their, body's growing into, like all of that stuff. And it really does lead to a moment where you realize, oh, this is that age where they're all starting to kind of like really be attracted to, the opposite sex, and they're really, finding out who they're going to be, and they're becoming much more brazen and bold in the things that they might do with each other. Even just, him laying his head back into her lap and she's playing with his hair, like it's such an intimate moment that they're having. And it lets you know too, I think, like you said, Malfoy has kind of gone from being somebody who is always just being kind of a twerp to being more of like the nonchalant, almost James Dean kind of leader here. Like he feels like this rebel with a maybe cause, and nobody knows yet. And so as they all leave the carriage, he says he's forgotten something and he'll be right there. And he knows where Harry is. He stuns him. He knocks him out with a little Petrificus Totalis, and then breaks his nose for his father, as payback. And that's where we leave the chapter of Harry lying on the ground underneath the
choking
cloak so nobody can see
blood.
him. And he's bleeding and he can't move.
All right. And I love that he knows where he is, which also kind of shows that Malfoy is pretty smart, is because I think it's Goyle accidentally hits Harry with his trunk when they were all putting the robes on. And Harry thought maybe he had gotten seen when he first snuck in the car. And it was the two things together that really told Malfoy that he was there, which was interesting because nobody else seemed to notice. So, we end the chapter with Harry lying on the ground with a busted nose. I think she describes like his nose is basically bleeding into his mouth. And he's like, oh God, I'm stuck.
Yeah.
What do I do?
It's pretty awful. So it's a great chapter, and again, I love the way that this chapter kind of leaves us, just hanging. You have to turn the page, but unfortunately you'll have to wait till next week as we talk about chapter 8 and Snape victorious. So, before that, Drea, anybody wants to catch up with you, see what's going on, where can they find you?
Sure. You can find me on Twitter at PCFchick or on Instagram at Drea Coffman, and it's Coffman.
And you can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, and Vero under the name MattRushing02. I am here on the network. I'm talking about Star Wars each and every week with John Mills. It is the time to be talking about Star Wars with The Mandalorian coming out, The Rise of Skywalker, Clone Wars coming back. So much happening, so don't forget to check that out each and every week. You can find me on the Trek FM network. There are 2 shows I'm doing there. One is called The Orb. I do that with Chris Jones. When we get a chance, we talk about Star Trek Deep Space Nine. You can find me doing the 602 Club, which is our general geek show. And, maybe if you tried next week, you might hear a voice you're very familiar with helping us let it go. So just leave that there. And then last but not least, I do a show with my good friend Courtney. We talk about movies through the lens of faith, and that's called Cinema Stories. But thank you so much for checking your Outpost.
Mischief managed.
Join the revolution. Join the Nerd Party.